Good morning to everyone. Welcome to the 25th anniversary presentation of the Peter Scheim Expo, Seton Hall University. I'm the Reverend Dr. Forrest Pritchett, a member of the Expo committee and a member of the faculty at this university. Um, Today, we're going to be looking at the area of the peoples and the cultures of America. And our interest in this subject really goes back a few decades when we realized that among our student body, there were many questions about immigrants, issues around who owns America, how did America get started, and who belongs here right now. So in that context, a number of faculty put together a task force to look at how we might use a new course at the university to begin to bring a little bit more, not only sensitivity, but understanding of our history. So in that context, we began to roll out a course called The Peoples and the Cultures of America. The course will extend for an entire year. It's a 6-credit option, 3+3. And in the first half of the course, we will look at America before it was America. We'll look at North America, the indigenous cultures that were here. We then begin to look at Spanish exploration and settlements within that territory. Then we move on to look at the English movement into the area. We look at the founding of the Jamestown colony, etc. And then we begin to move all the way through events, which will then take us up to and through World War II. Then in the second half of the course, in the spring semester, we look at America post up to the present. We hope to have a very stimulating environment for the students, in which we are free and open, and we have a safe space so that anything whatsoever, any topic, any question can be raised and discussed, and not only in an informative manner, but in an open-minded manner. And so in that context, I'd like to begin to walk you through, generally, an overview of the content and the types of models and paradigms and concepts that we develop. And then we're going to have a student or two who will present some of the research that they were inspired to take a look at. With that in mind, let's take a look basically at the organization of at least that first semester of the course. Fundamentally, what you'll see is going to be that flow of activities that will carry us through the entire semester, week by week. So that for the most part, you'll see that in the overview, what we're emphasizing as our learning modules will be the development of concepts to start with. A concept in many cases can be a single word or 2 words, which will convey sometimes a very complex type of idea that has to be described. For example, we think about for the first few hundred years of Americans' existence, we think about how do people who immigrate here, how do they become American? And how do they become naturalized? How do they learn to speak the English language? How do they learn, if they don't already, if that's not your native language? How do they learn the policies, procedures, and customs? Well, all of that can be summarized probably in one word, which may be the term assimilation. How does one go from one culture and then assimilate yourself into another culture? So that gives you an example of the many different concepts that could be handled. And we'll probably identify hundreds of those during the term of the semester. Then we look at paradigms. Paradigms then become working models that we can develop that might show the interconnections between various pieces of information, but that each of the different modelings that we could develop are critical, very crucial to that analysis, and indeed require faithful types of investigation. Then move on to look at our own, if you would, thinking processes, which would be and one way of clarifying our thinking process. You know, each of us has the same type of brain, you know, below our skin levels. Um, but in many cases, there can be sources of information which are very objective, and sometimes the information can be somewhat influenced by subjective factors. So we emphasize the whole role of critical reasoning skills, how to keep your mind open and clear thinking. For example, um, a model that would be very applicable to our current period of time here in April of 2021. If you think back over the last 13 months in America and the world, where we all have been dealing with the realities of a virus. So we might, as an introduction to the whole area of clear and critical reasoning skills, might use the model of saying all over the world we have virologists who are working in biomedical laboratories looking to find out the model of the virus which is impacting the entire world. And the last time I looked, for example, under the COVID family of viruses, I believe they identified well over 30 different types. So the type that was impacting most of the world over the last year was COVID-19 as we move on. And those researchers have to bring the best of their skills as a to their laboratories, looking for the development of vaccines and so forth. So we mentioned that indeed, if there is anything which clouds their thinking, anything that distracts them, or any, if you would, I would hate to use the term impurities, but if any types of false information get into the way in which they are processing what they're doing, if anybody is slack in their responsibilities, then obviously that means that literally the outcome of their research is not going to be effective. And we in the world are waiting for, if you would, in this context, effective vaccines to be rendered to the market. Many people may even ask the question, why are there so many several different types of vaccines? Well, it's a matter of different constructions and within the biomedical paradigms that are used. For example, you know, some parts of the world live in temperate climates, which means that during the year, there are going to be a variety of temperatures. There's not simply one consistent temperature ranging from either very warm or very cold as an outdoor temperature. Then there are other climates in which indeed it is constantly very hot as you step outside, and others in which it is going to be extremely cold each day. Now, in that context, then that's going to impact, once again, I think the chemical structure, so that one needs to be prepared, as you've already probably heard, to either have adequate amounts of refrigeration available, and then we have to look at then the infrastructure of a country. Is it prepared to either utilize a platform that involves refrigeration, or is the country perhaps so underdeveloped electrical grid that refrigeration may be impractical? Therefore, that team of researchers has to develop an entirely different platform, which will allow for the chemical structure of that vaccine to survive in the nature of perhaps just an average environment in which the extremes of temperature are not going to have an impact. So once again, that helps us just to get into the area of critical reasoning. Then obviously one of the most important areas for us to, if you would, keep an open mind and a clear mind and understand the types of signals that one is receiving is by understanding questions in America that will deal with the issues of race, class, sexual orientation. And if we went back to almost the very beginnings of this territory before it was even a nation, questions of religion, and the acceptance of other religions other than one's own. And then the last thing, as you can see from the overview of the course, would be the development of models. Once again, that would help us to do further explanation. So that as we move into this, I'm just going to walk through this very briefly. You can read these for yourself. Reading from the top to the bottom, each one of these will represent a week within our semester, looking at the earliest peoples living in a village-like community, eye-to-eye contact, and so forth. Then we look at the indigenous nations that occupied North America. I might point out that these indigenous nations never called themselves Indians. There's another long story that we could get into to explain that. But there were well over 500 different nations which existed in North America before there was any penetration of people coming in from Europe or from Spain. And so we take time to appreciate all of those various nations, their structures. We identify the myths that have been generated, but we go on to honor and respect really the people whose land we now occupy. We take a look also broadly at other civilizational patterns between Western civilization, really coming on the heels of understanding the great Asian civilizations, Arabic civilizations, Islamic civilizations, African civilizations, Asian civilizations, and so forth. We look at then the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of capitalism, capitalism and colonialism, and how that has impacted, class structures throughout the emergence of the modern world. Capitalism and wealth building through the institution of slavery. We look at the long-term consequences of the enslavement of a group of people, perhaps of African descent, for well over 300 years, and the long-term consequences for that type of behavior. Then we will look at the immigration patterns of various groups coming through the nation. We then will be able to develop a paradigm and a model for what would appear to be how the residual of hate, intolerance, discrimination, segregation against various groups have manifested itself up to World War II. Then we look at, as it says there, the policy paradigms, the great enfranchisement of that World War II veterans population, and so forth. So in that context, then in the latter stages of the course, students will have been reading multiple texts of their choosing to look specifically at various problems they'd like to focus on, and we will be highlighting the work of one or two students today. Now, for example, this gives us all an overview, because it's extremely important, handling literally America from the beginning. If you look at the right-hand side of your screen, where we had the indigenous population, we then identify four major periods in which we then also can identify the various groups that made up the composition of those immigration groups and their impact. And we would always look at each of these columns and read from the top to the bottom to keep that in a sequential order. We then see, if we look at the periods involved, we look at the period, if we identify it, that might start with the incursion of the story that every probably elementary school child in America can tell, that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But obviously the story and then starts for hundreds of years prior to that with understanding the entire history of those indigenous cultures and that long history before we even get to the first wave of immigrants. So we see them identified here, moving up to the period coming then post World War II, and our extreme left, 1945. So you can let that sink in a little bit. And there is a specific history that will apply to each and every group that you see here that we will do our best to honor in our presentations. Okay. Here we see one of the models that we have developed and taken from Reverend Brenner's ecological development himself. So that what we're looking at here, from if you would literally the sky down, is each of us as our life goes from development, and as we then move into the realm of living a life. So if we look into at the center of this circle of life, you can see that we all start off as in our infancy, and everything we learn from language, values, love, affection, hatred, what we pleasure, what we like, is all centered in that middle, where we are nurtured and socialized into a family structure. We learn to play with the kids in the neighborhood, and well, hopefully we do. And before we move into the school system, and then probably perhaps once a week, families take us out in terms of their values to a house of worship, house of faith. Then as we begin to progress through life, we find ourselves just taking that walk of life through our major institutions, from the educational institution, religious institutions, educational institutions, where everything we do is about gearing us to be participants in an economic system. And all of those prior systems are regulated by the political system. So this is simply a graphic which illustrates all of that very carefully. Now I'm pleased to be able to introduce to everyone one of our students, I'll ask him to introduce himself, give us his year and his major in school, and have him describe his work to you. So I believe we have at least two young men, so I'm going to ask whichever one is available, that they will start now, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jason. I'm a senior political science major, and I took this class last year as a result of being really interested in sort of how America came to be, and the research that Dr. Pritchard mentioned that I ended up doing was on a book called The Counter-Revolution of 1776, which details a sort of different history than the one I was used to learning. It tells the story of the founding of America, but from the perspective of slave rebellions. So sort of a different tale than what I was used to learning. And a lot of it was surprising to me. So I hope I can share that with you. So just to give a recap of the book tells through the entire book a lot about slave rebellions. It starts off in Jamaica with Tacky's Rebellion, which is sometimes called Tacky's War. These Africans were treated poorly. Jamaica was one of the worst spots for slaves. And Tacky, who is a person, led this group of Africans, and they actually took over a few plantations, a few shops, and then the British sent over militia and sort of had them, stifled and put down. The rebellion didn't last a few weeks, it lasted a few years. It inspired future rebellions, and it inspired the British to limit African American power. They instituted harsh codes against them. They limited their contact with other people because they felt vulnerable. These people were trying to take over this island that was theirs, that they owned, and they didn't want that to happen. So they felt vulnerable, especially because the slaves were successful. They were seemingly on the path to taking over this island. So British laws flip-flopped on slavery. They had been sort of lenient. They were now becoming more strict. And then they sort of flip-flop again later on. And this leads to British attitudes affecting the colonists, because the colonists obviously wanted to keep their slaves, and the book gets into how that impacted the Revolutionary War. So the book also mentions the 1688 Bill of Rights. This instituted a lot of, sort of was like a founding document, and it basically detailed lots of individual rights and private rights for citizens and corporations. It led to the rise of private slave trading. Even though the government did have a hand in it, they wanted corporations and private entities to have a larger part. And this led to the fall of the Royal African Company, which was led by the Duke of York. This was seen as a reform of the slave trade, which didn't really help the slaves, but helped out the individuals. It weakened the crown, it weakened slaves, but it helped the overall nation. So then the book details the part that other nations played in these revolutions, namely the French and Spanish. So in these sort of southern colonies, they often had a lot of, not a lot, but some contact with other foreign groups, because immigrants were coming over, as Dr. Pritchard mentioned, in these waves. And so they got to talking with these groups, and they would pass information back to where they came from. So slaves led revolts with help of other foreign groups. Obviously, the French and Spanish had an interest in taking down British colonies. They wanted more power for themselves. They wanted this new world to harvest their resources or take over the land or whatever. And they had an interest in stopping Britain from doing that. So some colonies had an African majority. Think of like South Carolina or Georgia, where they had more slaves than free white people. So they sought to rectify this problem by accepting more white people, bringing them in. But the problem with that was that they couldn't just accept any white person, because they often had ties to the French government or the Spanish government, or they were coming over to work with slaves. So this led to more codes being instituted, namely that house searching was increased and allowed, and conspiracy was made illegal. So putting those on the books, that slaves could not communicate with foreign governments, could not communicate with basically foreign individuals, and that the government was able to search their house and take anything they wanted that was related to a plot that they saw fit. Then the book also details further the Spanish. They, I guess, had a larger rivalry with the British than the French. They were against the British for religious reasons. They were also over here in America. They owned, they had Florida, what is now Florida. So France wasn't really over here. They didn't have a large part in the battle. So yeah, just to get into this, the Spanish were against the British for religious reasons. The Spanish had different religious views than the British. They also were against them for just power and political reasons. So one thing that they did was they offered freedom in the land of Florida. So a lot of slaves were coming down from South Carolina and Georgia and just running from where they were to Florida. They would often join the army that was present in that area and would seek to, or would not seek to, but because they were at a disposition to enact violence against the people that had enslaved them. So Oglethorpe, who was the man behind the Georgia colony, he was the founder. He came up with a plan to keep Georgia as a model society. He banned slavery. He thought it would make colonists lazy. He banned liquor and rum. He did not allow lawyers or Catholics. And he said the largest farms could only be 500 acres. This was just to limit slaves' power. And also keep people from running away to Florida. And there were obviously a few other reasons that the Spanish had for granting freedom. They wanted more people to take over this land. So yeah, this conflict between the Spanish and the British led to the Stono's Rebellion, which you can see here. Black slaves went down to a shop and killed the owners, and then they tried to make it to Florida and basically starts this huge uprising of multiple states. So the British sent their militia and they put down this uprising and instituted more codes and more punishments. This was mostly in South Carolina. It upset the balance politically, and it led to a large debate over how to treat your slaves. Do you treat them poorly so that they're more likely to revolt? Do you treat them well so that they're less likely to revolt, but they don't get as much done? Or do you free them? And the problem with freeing them was they had obviously been enslaved. They were already violent. And they were angry at being enslaved for as long as they'd been here. And this led to the 7 Years' War, which is the war between the Spanish and the British. And just to give you sort of an overview of the territory here. So the blue is Spanish land, and the red is English land, and the gray is French land. So this, obviously the British won. Florida became a British colony, which really dropped Spain off the influence list on this in this land. French also lost, so they lost some influence. However, because of the cost of the war, it left British open to colonist revolt. And because of the attitudes towards slavery in Jamaica and the shifting attitudes in Britain that were becoming more open towards freeing slaves, colonists were also open to revolt. So we see these revolts pop up in America, especially in the North, with New York City playing a huge part, where slaves were planning on burning down the entirety of New York City and taking over. And the people that were in charge, Othello and Quack, were hanged. Many more were executed. And the government created an incentive to discover plots that were instituted by slaves. So as I mentioned, abolition, this movement was growing in Britain. This is sort of getting to the end of the book. And the book mentions this was a big cause for the Revolutionary War. The colonists wanted to keep their slaves. The British were leaning towards abolishing their slaves. That led to a big conflict, and the colonists had an opportunity for this conflict. And slavery was banned in Britain in the 1830s, which is 35 years prior to when America did it, and many more years prior than a lot of their other colonies. And so I asked the question, would slavery have been banned earlier if Britain won the Revolutionary War? It's sort of rhetorical, but it is something to consider about our revisionist history. So some takeaways from the novel, the storytelling. Colonists fought for slavery in the Revolutionary War. They fought to, keep their slaves and not allow them to do uprisings or not allowing them to be free. And they won, and so they were allowed to keep their slaves past when Britain abolished them. And there was this difference in feeling towards slaves of pre-revolutionary versus antebellum colonists, where before they were under British rule and they had to do what British officials told them to do, and after they were able to control them in their own way. So those are the takeaways from the novel. It's very different from what I learned. I did not know that colonists had fought for slavery. I had been told that, or I had been taught that colonists fought because, because of taxation without representation. And, that while that may be true, there's also this big underlying piece of slavery that was at the forefront.
Okay, Jason, we want to thank you very much. And if you don't mind me asking, since you are a senior, what are you looking forward to as your next adventure in life?
Well, I have a place with some friends. We're moving to Harrison, and I'm looking for some political jobs, political analyst or research jobs in New York City or in the New Jersey area.
Thank you for sharing that. We're glad that there is a bright future waiting for you, and as soon as we can put COVID behind us, I think it'll put a smile.
I'm very much looking forward to a post-COVID world.
Yes, sir.
Back out there.
I think in about 3 to 4 more weeks, also, we're looking forward to your the graduation ceremonies.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm now going to ask if anyone who's watching this has a question. You may post it in the chat while I just take one other, as I add another point. To give the context in which you heard Jason's presentation. So at the point that we are about 1/3 through each semester, we will make available to the students a listing of books. It will be well over 60, covering well over, in a sense, 50 different types of topics that would be supplemental to all of the analysis that we've done. So the students are encouraged to look at it, that list, from the perspective of if there's something else you'd like to learn about a given topic, noticing that there is something that you not only want to go more into, but you're noticing that indeed the way in which, as Jason mentioned clearly, the way in which something had been presented to you previously, perhaps a lot of other detail was left out, which might make some sense in a practical sense. When we were all in elementary school, middle school, and high school, I guess one could say that in every circumstance, it is almost impossible to render each and every fact and detail for any particular subject. But what's most curious, if we look at it, is what's left out of the story, and why is it left out? And or we could say what parts of a given story or historical circumstance and situation, what part of that story is told versus what is not. So there's where we engage ourselves in the realm of critical thinking, and we're so pleased because um, the university core curriculum and all of the various proficiencies that our students must show by the time they are ready to graduate includes critical reasoning skills. So this course contributes to that in a great way, and we've been so proud to be the stewards over that responsibility. So Jason, we want to thank you for your time today. And as I begin to wrap up, at least someone put a little note of thanks in the chat to you because they learned a lot from your presentation. And that indeed is one of our outcomes for that course, is that each of you will leave the course with an artifact in the form of those PowerPoints that you may be able to use over and over again. Surprisingly, you may find that even as a citizen in your community at some point in time, in various public meetings, um, whether it comes to celebrating July the 4th or just on any occasion whatsoever, you now have a product which the more you work with it and you even begin to refine it or add more to it, or actually it's great as it is right now, you'll be able to hopefully make us all better in the community. So I'd like to thank everybody who will be seeing this, whether today or in the future. I want to thank the members of our tech team for being so supportive of our efforts through the this 25th exposition of the Petersheim Expo. Big shout outs to both Mike and Burke for their continuous support. So once again, on behalf of the Expo Committee, I want to thank everybody for being present today, and we'll see you soon. We have numerous events going on throughout the university this week, culminating with our closing ceremony at 3 o'clock on Friday. So once again, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you all for your support, and have a good day and have a great life. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.